Last time we talked, we were talking about the pandemic, but things have changed. In fact, here in Pittsburgh, we've had thousands of peaceful protesters, but we've also had looting, arson, and injuries. While the National Guard has been called out elsewhere, not here, is it your view and the president's that governors and local officials are not able to deal with this? Should the president step in militarily?
Well, John, as you said, there've been tens of thousands of peaceful protesters, not just in Pennsylvania, but all across the country, who've gathered to share our sense of grief with the tragic death of George Floyd. And we stand with peaceful protesters, but those who have used these protests to perpetrate violence and looting and rioting must be opposed. And it's the reason why the president and I called on every governor across the country to use their resources and their National Guard to bring order to their streets. I mean, to see these rioters that are engaging in looting and to actually see the violence against law enforcement officers that took place last night in New York and in Missouri is absolutely inexcusable. And it's the reason why the president and I will continue to urge governors like Governor Wolf to call up the National Guard, deploy them to the streets in a strong and decisive manner to restore order. The American people expect nothing less. And we've also made it very clear, as the president did here in our nation's capital last night, that if governors fail to establish order in the streets of our city, we stand ready, as previous administrations have done, to deploy active duty military personnel to quell the violence, to quell the looting, and the president's prepared to do that. But we believe it's incumbent on governors, it's incumbent on mayors to step forward, use the full resources that they have, including the National Guard, and we're going to continue to urge the governor of Pennsylvania to do just that.
Well, in your view, Mr. Vice President, has Governor Wolf and the local mayors failed?
Well, I'd leave that to people in the community to judge. We're obviously tracking violent rioting and looting in major cities around the country. But I do know that as of yesterday morning, I think Governor Wolf had only called up some 500 or 600 members of the National Guard. That was a similar number of what Minnesota had called up, to very little effect in quelling the violence and the rioting that was taking place in Minneapolis. It's the reason why President Trump encouraged the governor of Minnesota to call up his strong presence of his National Guard. When he did that, when he deployed 7,000 personnel, they were able to reestablish security in Minneapolis. And whatever the real need is, the president made it clear to all of our nation's governors that they need to use the resources of their own state National Guard, which remember, these are our neighbors. These are men and women who live and work in our community. They're citizen soldiers who sign on to the National Guard. They are trained to serve our nation and alongside active duty military, but they're also trained to deal with domestic crises within the state's jurisdiction. And they, along with local law enforcement, are, we believe, best positioned to reestablish order in the streets. And we're going to continue to call on states across the country to utilize their National Guard, because the American people deserve law and order in the streets of our cities.
Mr. Vice President, you're a man of faith, and many who are faithful are expressing disbelief and anger at the president's photo op at St. John's Church in Washington. They say they're offended. What is your response to that? Was it an appropriate use of force to clear Lafayette Square? And have you considered taking a knee, as others have done, in solidarity with George Floyd?
Well, the president and I have both expressed our sympathies and sadness in the tragic death of George Floyd. And we stand with peaceful protesters. But I must tell you, to see the images of night before last of one of the most cherished churches in the history of this country, St. John's, just across the park from our nation's capital, a church where every president from James Madison forward has worshiped from time to time, to see that church set ablaze And fortunately, that blaze did not consume the structure it was put out, was just a disgrace. And as the president addressed the nation from the Rose Garden yesterday, as he announced plans to secure our nation's capital, how we called on governors to use their National Guard, the president also thought it was important to walk across the park and to stand in solidarity with St. John's, and I think it was an important moment. It was an important moment to say that these streets, whether they be our pharmacies, our grocery stores, our homes, our places of worship, these belong to the American people, not to the rioters, not to those who would do violence, who would burn down facilities and beat people, as we saw in Texas, who are trying to protect their own property. We can stand with peaceful protesters and also stand up for law and order, and that's exactly what the president was about yesterday.
As far as you're concerned, it was an appropriate use of force to remove the peaceful protesters in order for him to do this?
I think the Secret Service and National Guard that were present moved the crowd in an orderly way to allow the president to pay his respects to St. John's.
Final question, Mr. Vice President. A couple hours ago, Vice President Biden accused President Trump of turning the country into a battlefield, fanning old resentments, fear, and hate, he said. And he called on Congress to work today on police reform bills outlawing chokeholds and banning transfer of military weapons to police. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think it was 12 years ago that President Obama, with Vice President Biden at his side, gave a speech about improving race relations in America. I will tell you, the record of the last 3.5 years, where we saw the lowest unemployment rate for African Americans in the history of this country, where we passed criminal justice reform for the first time in 40 years, where we actually have created tens of thousands of opportunity zones, creating investment in our inner cities and for our minority communities, including African Americans, is a record the president and I are very proud of. But the American people can count on the fact that whatever their background, whatever their race, those who would come to our streets, not to peaceably protest, but to riot and to steal and to loot, are going to be confronted with law enforcement. We're going to have law and order on our streets, whether it be the streets of Pittsburgh, whether it be the streets of Indianapolis, New York City, or our nation's capital. And the American people expect nothing less, and that's why President Trump said, we're going to do what it takes to stand for law and order in this country, even while we stand by the rights of peaceful protesters all across this nation.
But should Congress outlaw chokeholds and ban transfer of military weapons to local police?
You know, I would leave those debates to others, but it does seem to me that there is a desire to try and change this discussion into one of a systemic problem in law enforcement. My experience is that most of the men and women who serve in law enforcement are dedicated, selfless people that get up every day, put their lives on the line to protect and serve. I think the important thing for us to do today is we respect the rights of people to engage in peaceful protest, but we have to make sure that justice is served in the case of George Floyd. It's the reason why the president has deployed federal investigators there to determine whether federal criminal charges are to be brought. We're gonna ensure that there is no tolerance in this country for behavior like that by a law enforcement official. But I think focusing on what happened there, grieving with that family, is the way we move our nation forward.
And you would take a knee in solidarity?
We stand with peaceful protesters, as the president said, all across this country. But there is no excuse, and there will be no tolerance for those who hide behind peaceful protesters and use them as a shield to steal and rob and destroy property in this country. And we're going to work with governors across the country to ensure that we have law and order on our streets.
Mr. Vice President, always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you, sir, very much for your time.
Thank you.
Just because the weekend starts doesn't mean our commitment to excellence stops. Wake up to KDKA TV News Saturday and Sunday morning.